Hi, I'm Tom, coming to you from the International Institute for the Advancement of Sourdough Science and Research of Cleveland, Ohio, also known as my kitchen. Thank you for selecting this video. Today I'm going to answer a question a lot of people ask, and that is, what do you do with your starter when you go on vacation for a month, or when you move to a new city, or you're going to take some time off from baking? How do you put your starter on hold, and then how do you refresh it after that? So I had the opportunity to do this recently. My wife and I went on an extended trip where we were away from our home for 32 days. So I'm going to tell you exactly what I did to put my starter on hold, and then I'm going to show you how I refresh this today. Now, the first thing that I recommend is, if you're putting your starter on hold, you always want to make a backup. So what I do is I dehydrate my starter. I have a video that shows how to do this. You basically spread your starter, try to catch it at peak, spread it on a piece of parchment paper, let it dry out for a day or two, and then crumble it up and put it in a bag. This will keep for a very long time. People ask how long this thing will keep for. Some people found dehydrated starter in the pyramids in Egypt. It was 3,500 years old, and they reactivated it and made bread out of it. I made this dried starter about 2 years ago, so this has 3,498 years until its expiration date. I strongly recommend always having a backup of your starter in case something goes wrong at any time, really. But always before you're going to put it on hold, maybe a day or two before you do that. So if you're not going to feed your starter for 30 days or more, you definitely don't want to just leave it on the countertop at room temperature, because it'll definitely consume all the flour. The yeast will start starving, and it'll significantly weaken your starter. So what I do when I put my starter on hold, and a lot of people do this, is you put it in the refrigerator. That's a very easy way to extend the life of your starter, so I'm going to tell you how I do that. So if you're planning to put your starter into the refrigerator for an extended period of time, you have to decide what feeding ratio do you want to give it. And the goal is, you don't want your starter to starve in the refrigerator. You want to give it enough food so when you come back and you take it out of the refrigerator, it still has some unconsumed flour in the jar. So I always start with kind of the basic standard feeding ratio of 1-1-1. That would be 30 grams of carryover starter, 30 grams of flour, 30 grams of water. Now, I've done that before when I've put my starter into the refrigerator for an extended period of time. And when I do that 1-1-1 feeding, it tends to come out fairly hoochy. Now, hooch is the name for the alcohol that develops on the top of your starter. When your yeast consumes all of the flour and it starts to starve, it'll start giving off alcohol, and you can smell it. It smells like moonshine. And that has happened to me when I've done that 1-1-1 feeding. So then you have the option and say, okay, what if I went up to 1-2-2, 1-3-3, or some kind of higher feeding ratio? I found that 1-2-2 isn't materially different from 1-1-1. So another option that really slows down your yeast activity in the refrigerator is not just to change that feeding ratio, but to change the hydration of your starter. And what I mean by that is, a 1-1-1 feeding ratio is 100% hydration. Equal parts flour and water is what you feed it. If you give your starter less water in that feeding and make a stiff starter, it'll significantly slow down the rate at which it eats the flour in the refrigerator. So what I recommend doing is a 1-1.5 feeding. So I'm basically going to make a stiffer, drier starter before I put it into the refrigerator. So in my example, I'll take 30 grams of my existing starter, I'll add 30 grams of flour, but I'll only add 15 grams of water. So that's what I did when I put my starter into the refrigerator over 30 days ago, as I mixed it up as a stiff starter. Now, this is a batch I just mixed up this morning to show you what my starter looked like when it went into the refrigerator a month ago. That's basically a stiff starter right there. Now, let me get my actual starter out of the fridge. So this is my actual starter that went into the fridge 33 days ago. So the first thing I do when I take it out is I want to smell it and see what's going on in here. So the things that I'm smelling for are, number one, I'm smelling for hooch. That's the alcohol that forms on the starter when it begins starving, when it's consumed all of the flour. The second thing I'm smelling for is the yeast. I want to smell the yeast because that's what I'm trying to perpetuate by putting this in the refrigerator. I also smell for acidity, or that vinegary smell, because if I'm smelling a lot of acidity, that means that the balance between the yeast and the lactic acid bacteria starts to get off during that long break and you need to start to work that acidity out of the mix. And the last thing I look for and smell for is mold. If your starter goes moldy in the refrigerator, you have to throw it out and start over again. Some people ask, can I just scrape the mold off the top and keep going? You can't do that, because if you see mold on top, there are mold tendrils that go all the way down into the starter. You just have to throw it out. And that is the reason for the dried starter backup, in case something bad happens during that slumber in the refrigerator. So, what am I smelling? I'm smelling yeast for sure. The smell's good. I smell a little bit of hooch. I smell a little bit of that alcohol smell, which means that the yeast was working its way through the flour. I don't know if it consumed all the flour or not. I don't smell any acidity at all, which is good. If your starter comes out of the refrigerator smelling really acidic, it takes a while to get it back into balance, and I don't see or smell any mold. So I have a yeasty, slightly hoochy, non-acidic, non-moldy starter. This is what it looks like. It's still stiff. You don't see that layer of hooch on top that you would see with a typical liquid starter. It's still fairly dry. It gets a little bit discolored on the top, but as long as you don't see mold on there, that's okay. So now that you've taken your starter out of the fridge, you have to decide, how are you going to feed it to bring it back to full strength? There are a lot of different approaches to this. Some people just say, I just take it out of the fridge and I just use it in my next batch of dough and just see what happens. I think that's a little crazy. I mean, you don't really know what's happening in here. Your starter could be incredibly weak, and if you're just going to try to make a batch of dough, you have no idea what's going to happen. You don't know what the yeast to acidity balance is. I mean, if you just want to roll the dice and try that, you're welcome to do that. I don't recommend that. I like to get my starter back to its original form, which is what I'm going to try to do through these steps. So the second thing that you have to think about is, how do you feed it? Some people would say, okay, my starter is coming out of the refrigerator. I'm going to discard 80% of it and do a 1-2-2 feeding. Really give it a big feeding to bring it back to life. Now, in my opinion, if this starter has been asleep in the refrigerator and I'm trying to bring my yeast back to full strength, why would I throw away 80% of my yeast before I even do the first feeding? So what I prefer to do is not discard anything when I take it out of the refrigerator. And all I'm going to do is add 15 grams of water to bring this back up to the 1-1-1 ratio. And I'm going to let this come back to life and see what happens. So just by adding the water and letting this reactivate, it'll tell me a lot about what happened in the refrigerator. If I add the water and it rises, that means I still have active yeast in the culture, and there was still uneaten flour in the mix. So I know that the yeast didn't actually starve. That means I have a fairly strong yeast culture coming out of the refrigerator. If I add the water, I let it sit and nothing happens, that's a bad sign. That means that my starter started starving. Say that 3 times. Starter started starving in the refrigerator, and then I have to work harder to get my yeast to come back. So by using this method, I'm giving the yeast an opportunity to tell me how things went in the refrigerator. How was your vacation? 30 days in cold storage. Did you have enough food to eat? I mean, I want the yeast to tell me how it went. So we're going to add 15 grams of water to this and let this rise. So I've added 15 grams of water. All I've done is brought this back up to its normal 100% hydration, where I've added the water that we didn't give it when we made the stiff starter. So this is essentially just back to a 1-1-1, no additional flour. I'm going to let this sit and see what happens. Now, when I bring a starter back to life out of the refrigerator, I use this warming mat. I'm not sure if you've seen these before. This is from a company called Rehydrate. This is called the Raisin Dough Riser. These are great. It's a warming mat that heats up to about 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 27 degrees Celsius. When my dough comes out of the refrigerator, it just speeds things up a little bit. I know that I need to do multiple feedings here, so I'm just going to try to move things along. I put this on the dough riser, let that sit, and we'll come back and look at this in a couple hours. So it's been 4 hours since I refreshed this starter with that 15 grams of water. You can see it's risen about 1/3 above the line where the rubber band was. So there's definitely some activity in here. So what does this mean? It means that this wasn't starving coming out of the refrigerator because I didn't add any flour to this mix. All I did was warm it up and added water. So that tells me that there was still food left in there from that feeding, so that 1.5 feeding that I did was plenty to cover 30 plus days in the refrigerator. It didn't consume all the flour. So now this needs food. So then you have to make the decision, do you discard and feed or just feed on top of this? I'm going to discard and feed, because when I smell this, I'm smelling alcohol in here, and I'm smelling a little bit of the acidity in here that I wasn't smelling before. So basically the starter is kind of swimming in its own waste now. So I'm going to discard most of this. I'm going to keep 30 grams. I'm going to feed it 30 grams of flour and 30 grams of water, just a basic 1-1-1 feeding. See if we can get this back on its feet. It looks pretty good right now. It's definitely alive. It's going to come back. So I have a clean jar here for my starter. I'm going to take 30 grams, add 30 grams of water. I like to mix up the starter and the water into a little slurry before I add the flour. And then I have a premix here. I use a 50-50 blend of bread flour and whole wheat flour. I mix up about a week's worth of it in this container so I don't have to get my bags out every day. I'm going to add 30 grams of that. So this is the 1-1-1 feeding. Now it's 7 o'clock at night, so I don't want to put this on the heating pad because then this is going to peak, early when I'm asleep, and then it'll be past its peak by the time I'm up in the morning. So I'm just going to leave this at room temperature overnight tonight. It'll be about 12 hours. This may rise and fall. I'm not too worried about trying to catch this at peak. I really just want full activity to get that yeast population back up. And then I'll pick this up again in the morning and we'll see how it looks and go for another feeding. And then when I'm refreshing a starter, I don't really have an active starter right now. I'm going to keep this discard just as a backup in case something went wrong with this one, just as a safety net. So it's the next morning. If we look at what the starter did overnight, it doubled in height and then it fell this morning. You can see the streaks on the side there. It was more than double about an hour and a half ago. This is about 14 hours after we did that 1-1-1 feeding. So I would have expected this to have risen and fallen in that amount of time. Let's take a look in the jar. You can see here it's bubbly on top. It's definitely past peak because it's fallen down. You can see it concaving around the sides there. And I'd say this is alive, but it's not like super active the way my normal starter would look. But this is much better than it looked yesterday. After one feeding, this is about where I would expect it to be. So now I smell this to try to figure out what's going on in here. The three smells that I'm looking for, one is the alcohol or the hooch. We want to work all that out of this starter. That's what develops when it's in the refrigerator for a long time. The second thing I want to smell is yeast. That's the good stuff. And the third thing I'm smelling for is acid, or that vinegary smell, which I don't want a real acidic starter because that slows down the yeast production. So I'm going to take a whiff. I still smell a hint of the alcohol, the hooch in here, but it's almost gone. I definitely smell the yeast, and I don't really smell much acid at all, which is great. So now I have to decide how to feed this based on what I just smelled. So again, I'm smelling for the hooch, the yeast, the acid. I want to work hooch out of the system. If there's alcohol in here, I just want to work that out, and I do that by discarding. If I'm smelling yeast, I basically want to feed it. And if I'm smelling a lot of acid, I want to do a big discard to try to reset that balance between the yeast and the lactic acid bacteria. So what I'm smelling is a little bit of hooch. I'm smelling good yeast. I'm not smelling acid. So what are my options for feeding? I could do no discard at all and just top this off with flour and water. I would only do that if I don't smell hooch or acid. That means I don't need to discard. I just need to feed the yeast and let the yeast take another run. But because I'm still smelling the hooch or the alcohol in here, I'm going to discard. So I'm not going to just do a top-off feeding. Then, if I'm going to do a discard feeding, I can either do my normal 1-1-1 or a higher feeding ratio of 1-2-2, 1-3-3, 1-4-4. And when I talk about a higher feeding ratio, you want to think about that as a higher discard ratio. Because in a 1-1-1, I'm discarding 2/3. In a 1-2-2, I'm discarding 80%. So basically, you're having a smaller carryover amount in those higher feeding ratios. I would only do that high feeding ratio if this was very acidic, where I need to knock down the acidity and really let this restart so I get the yeast and lactic acid bacteria back in shape. I'm not smelling a lot of acidity in here, so I don't need to do a high feeding ratio. It's a long explanation, but a lot of people just want a basic formula that just says, on day 1 do this, on day 2 do this, on day 3 do that. It all depends on what's going on in the jar. I'm trying to explain what I'm doing here. So because I got a little hooch, I have no acid, I'm going to do 1-1-1 feeding. Moderate discard, give it a refresh, let it go. Now, one other thing I want to point out is during the middle of the night, I was dreaming about sourdough baking, so I came out here to the kitchen. I wanted to check on my starter, see how it was doing. It was about 1 a.m., so that was 6 hours after we did the 1-1-1 feeding yesterday. I looked in the jar, nothing was happening. It was completely flat. It looked like it was dead. I mean, there wasn't a single bubble on top after 6 hours. And this is the fatal moment, the fatal flaw that people make, is that if you look at your starter and you say, oh my God, nothing's happening, I think I killed it, maybe I should discard and refeed again. If you discard a weak starter, you make it weaker. I can't emphasize this enough. So many people screw up their starters by being impatient. If it's not bubbling on top, never discard. I mean, that's a simple rule. Never discard if the starter hasn't peaked or it isn't covered with bubbles on top. Just give it time. The starter tells you when it's hungry. It tells you when it needs more food. That's only after it's risen and fallen or after it's completely covered with bubbles on top. If you look at the starter and nothing's happening, it's not saying I'm hungry. It's not saying I'm dead. It's just saying I'm taking a nap. I'm getting off to a slow start today. I haven't had my coffee yet. I need a little bit more time. So resist the temptation to discard a weak, inactive starter. It makes it weaker. So after a long answer to a short question, we're going to feed this 1-1-1 because I want to discard a little bit, but I don't need to discard a lot. So I'm going to keep 30 grams of starter. I'm going to add 30 grams of flour, and I'm going to add 30 grams of water. Now, do I need to use a fresh jar? No. Here's a little trick that I use is I know how much my jar weighs. You say, how do I know? Because I write it on the bottom. Right there. 270 grams is what my empty jar weighs. If I want to keep 30, then all I need to do is measure my discard. So I get a separate jar, and now what I'm doing is measuring my discard. So by using that subtraction method, I know I have 30 grams left in here. So now I'm going to add 30 grams of water. Here's another trick I do, is when you add the water, if you want to clean your jar, put the lid on tightly. I just made a nice starter slurry, and I cleaned down the walls of my jar. Now, 30 grams of my flour blend, half whole wheat, half bread flour. So here's our second feeding back up to the rubber band line. So just to recap, I took the starter out of the fridge, I topped it off with water, that first refresh, waited till it rose, did the first true feeding with flour and water last night, second feeding this morning. Now we're going to let this rise today and see how it looks. I'm trying to get this back to full strength. So I have to ask myself the question, what temperature do I want to keep this at? It's the morning, my kitchen temperature is 72 degrees Fahrenheit, 22 degrees Celsius. I could leave this on the countertop at room temperature, or I could put it back on my warming mat, raise it up to about 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 27 degrees Celsius. I'm going to use the warming mat, and I'm really just doing this for my benefit because I want to speed things up. I know that I still have to do multiple feedings here, so I'm just going to move things along a little bit faster. When you decide what temperature you want your sourdough starter to be at, there are a lot of different opinions on this. What I find is if I leave my starter on the warming mat all the time, it favors the acidity, and I get a fairly acidic starter if I keep it at 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 27 degrees Celsius. If I keep it at room temperature, 72 or 22, that keeps the acidity down a little bit. So by putting it on the warming mat, I'm just accelerating it because I know I'm going to be doing multiple feedings after this, so I'm not worried about the acidity building up. I don't recommend putting it on the warming mat all the time. So while we're waiting for the starter to come back to life, let me just take a brief moment and talk about how to revive this dried starter that I talked about earlier. Now, if you go to my website at thesourdoughjourney.com under the tools section, I have a detailed guide that goes through step-by-step, day by day that tells you how to do this. And I've sent this dried starter out to many people, and I've helped people online revive a dried starter. The biggest problem that I see people run into is what they do is you mix up 30 grams of dried starter with 30 grams of water, and what you need to do is to wait for that to fully activate until it's fully covered with bubbles, and then you don't discard, you just feed it again, wait till that's covered with bubbles again, then feed it again. So you're basically trying to just feed the dried starter without discarding. The biggest problem that I see is that people mix the flour and water, they wait about 12 hours, then they wait about 24 hours, and it still hasn't reactivated, so they get nervous, and they say, even though the guide says don't discard, I'm going to discard 80% and feed it again because that's what somebody online told me to do, or that's what some book said. Then they wait another 12 hours or another 24 hours, it's still not fully activated, and they discard 80% and they feed it again. By doing 2 discards in a row like that, you've discarded 96% of what you started with, and then you wonder why it's not reactivating. The biggest problem I find with reviving a dried starter, strengthening a weak starter, creating a new starter is that people get impatient and they think that discarding and refeeding will help strengthen the starter. If you discard and refeed a weak starter, it makes it weaker. It's unequivocal. If you discard and refeed a weak starter, it makes it weaker because you're discarding 80% of the yeast population that you're trying to grow. So just as a general rule, if your starter is slow, it's sluggish, the worst thing you can do is discard and refeed. You can't force feed a starter. Just give it time. It'll tell you when it's hungry. Your starter is hungry when it's risen and fallen, or when it's completely covered with bubbles, or when it's hoochie. Those are the only circumstances where your starter is hungry. It's telling you. If your starter is sitting there and not bubbling, it's not because it's starving, it's just because it's weak or it's asleep. It tells you when it's hungry. That's the key message on reviving any type of starter. Never discard and refeed a weak starter that hasn't peaked or fully bubbled on top. Here's a pop quiz. Let's say you fed this starter 4 hours ago. You were expecting it to rise because somebody online told you it should rise in 4 hours. You look at this and it looks like this. It's flat on top. There are no bubbles. It hasn't risen. Should you discard and refeed this to make it grow faster, to make it stronger? No. Discarding and refeeding a weak starter makes it weaker. Here's another example. Let's say you fed this starter 12 hours ago and somebody told you it should have risen and fallen in 12 hours. You look at your starter, it looks like this. There are no bubbles on top. It hasn't risen and fallen. What should you do? Discard and refeed? Never. Never discard and refeed if it hasn't risen and fallen. It hasn't even eaten the food yet. It's still full. It's got a full plate in front of it. Here's another example. 24 hours prior, you fed this. You come back, you look at it 24 hours. There are no bubbles on top. It hasn't risen and fallen. What should you do? Discard and refeed? No, never. Don't do it. It makes it weaker. Your starter needs time. It just needs time. It doesn't need more food. You can't force feed it. And every time you discard it, you weaken it. Then after 24 hours, you start to second guess yourself and you say, I'm not sure if I trust this Tom guy. I'm going to go online and ask some random person their opinion. So you go online and say, I fed my starter 24 hours ago. It's flat. It hasn't bubbled. It hasn't peaked and fallen. What should I do? People online will say, that's easy. Discard 80%. Feed it twice a day. Feed it 3 times a day. Discarding and feeding is what makes your starter stronger. It's false. It makes your starter weaker. For God's sake, people, if your starter hasn't bubbled and risen and fallen, there's still food left in here, and discarding and refeeding makes it weaker. It's been 4 hours since that morning feeding 111. Take a look at the starter. It's more than doubled. I mean, that's beautiful. So this is really making a comeback. If I open this up and smell it, it smells yeasty. That smells good. It's still not acidic, which is great. Now, when I feed my starter, I smell it first, I look at it, and I never want to feed it until it's at peak or maximum bubbles on top. This has peaked. If I look down in here, It's actually concave, so it's starting to fall at 4 hours already. So this is moving pretty quickly. So now that the starter is rising normally, it's doubling in 4 hours, which is great. It's still not quite back to full strength. So anytime I try to strengthen my starter, what I recommend is a method that I call peak-to-peak feeding. With peak-to-peak feeding, you ignore the clock, you watch the starter. After it rises, you look for it to peak. It'll be domed up on top. Then when it peaks, it'll be concave on top, which is what I'm seeing in here. So that means that this has peaked, at least in terms of height. So now it's safe to discard and refeed without weakening my starter because it's past peak. So what I recommend is you catch it right at peak. That's when the yeast is at its maximum point. Discard 80%, and now we go to a 1-2-2 feeding. So now you ask the question, why am I going from 1-1-1 to 1-2-2? 1-1-1 is just my basic maintenance feeding, but now that this is getting back to full strength, I'm going to 1-2-2 just to give it a little more food to stretch out that interval, so I'm not doing feedings every 3 hours. I'm just trying to stretch out the time. So I'm going to do a 1-2-2 feeding of the starter. Now the way that I calculate this is I know we have 90 grams of starter in here because we started with 30 grams of carryover. We added 30 grams of flour, we added 30 grams of water, so I have 90. If you want to do a 1-2-2, you add up the parts. 1 + 2 + 2 is 5, so I divide 90 by 5, that's 18. So if I want to do a 1-2-2, it would be 18 grams of carryover starter, 36 grams of flour, 36 grams of water. Just to use round numbers, I'm going to do 20, 40, 40. So we're going to go up from a total starter quantity of 90 to 100 just to keep the numbers round. 20 grams of carryover starter, 40 grams of flour, 40 grams of water. Let's do it. I have 90 grams of starter in here. I want to have 20 when I'm done. I subtract 70 using my subtraction method. There's my 20 grams of starter. 1-2-2 feeding means I had 40 grams of water. Shake it up. Now I add 40 grams of flour. So this is our third feeding since I took this out of the refrigerator. I'm not counting that first one where I just added water. Let's just call that the rehydration. Then 3 feedings, which is normally what it takes for me to refresh a starter coming out of the fridge. I'm going to put this back on the warming mat. We'll check this. Now I did a 1-2-2 feeding. It's going to take a little bit longer to rise versus a 1-1-1, all other variables being equal, but it's also increasing in strength, so it may actually catch up with that prior time. So some of you are probably looking at this discard and you're asking 2 questions. One is, Tom, what are you going to do with that discard? And number 2 is, why do you even need to create all this discard? Good questions. Answering the second one first, when I do multiple feedings like this, I usually do micro feedings. I start with 5 or 10 grams so that I'm not discarding as much. But for purposes of the video, I'm using a little bit larger quantity here just so you can see the rise and see what's happening a little more clearly on the camera. Now I still generate discard from time to time. I'll accumulate this in my refrigerator, but my quantities are so small. Sometimes I'll make crackers. There's some good discard cracker recipes. And sometimes if it's a small amount like this, I'll just put it into my compost, send it out, and I use it in my garden for fertilizer. I also like to think about the yeast and lactic acid bacteria in here as being released into the wild because their cousins that are in my starter now are going to die a fiery death in the oven. So I like to send a few of them back to nature. So it's been 3 hours since we did the 1-2-2 feeding. This starter has already tripled in volume. It's incredible. Now think about that, because we gave it a 1-1-1 feeding on the last feeding and it took 4 hours to double. Now we gave it a 1-2-2 feeding and it took 3 hours to triple. So you have to think about what we did here. We used less starter. In the prior feeding, we used 30 grams of starter. In this feeding, we used 20 grams of starter. So we used less starter. We gave it more food, and it actually grew faster. It tripled in 3 hours as opposed to doubling in 4 hours. So that means the starter is strengthening, the yeast population is growing, and the acidity is staying low. It's letting the yeast really do its job. It's not impeding the yeast production. So this is a fabulous result here. This is really back to full strength. I mean, this smells like my normal starter. It's yeasty. It has kind of a sweet, ripe smell. Kind of smells like a a ripe banana. There's no acidity. I don't smell any of the hooch, the alcohol that was in here from when we took it out of the refrigerator. So this is back in business. I can't wait to start baking some bread with this. I've been off for quite a while. So now let me just recap what we've done here. I basically put my starter into the refrigerator a little bit over a month ago. I made it a stiff starter. I used half as much water relative to the flour. I stiffened it up, and that slows down the fermentation process in the refrigerator. We took it out of the refrigerator after 33 days. The first thing that I did was I didn't feed it any flour. I just gave it back that water to bring it back up to the 100% hydration ratio, mixed it up, let it rise on the warming pad. After about 4 hours, it rose a little bit. You could tell that it was still alive, but it was weak. So then I discarded everything but 30 grams. I did a 1-1-1 feeding, 30 grams of retained starter, 30 grams of flour, 30 grams of water, left that overnight. That was the slow riser. That took almost 14 hours to rise. I looked at it in the middle of the night. It wasn't doing anything, but I resisted the temptation to discard and refeed a weak starter, because you should never do that if you were paying attention. Then this morning at about 10 o'clock, it had peaked. So we did the second feeding of flour and water. That was a 1-1-1 feeding. And then it bounced back fairly quickly. It doubled in 4 hours. So it seemed to be growing in strength. The speed at which it was rising was improving. So then we discarded all but 20 grams and did a 1-2-2 feeding 3 hours ago. And it's tripled now. So basically, in a little more than 1 day, we took a dormant starter out of the fridge and got it back to full strength. That's pretty typical with what I've seen. Usually it takes 3 feedings coming out of the fridge, sometimes 4 feedings, to get it back to full strength. This is a great example of how resilient your starter can be, even when you give it a long slumber in the fridge. If you found this video to be helpful, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Then you'll get notifications when I post interesting new videos. You can also follow me on Instagram, and you can find me on Facebook. Thanks for watching this video, and good luck on your sourdough journey.